Have you ever felt that moment when your past walks through the door and your entire world just stops? When every instinct screams run, but your feet feel like they're cemented to the floor. Tonight, as I balanced 3 plates on my arm and tried to keep my smile bright for the evening rush, I was about to learn that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected and dangerous places. The scent of garlic and basil filled Nana's, the upscale Italian restaurant where I'd been working for the past 6 months. 6 months since I'd finally found the courage to leave Marcus. 6 months of rebuilding my life one tip at a time, one day of freedom at a time. The warm lighting cast everything in amber tones, and the soft chatter of satisfied customers created a cocoon of normalcy I'd grown to cherish. My name is Sophia Delacroix, and at 24, I was finally learning what it meant to breathe without checking over my shoulder every 5 minutes. Well, mostly. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they were getting better. Dr. Martinez said that was normal, that healing wasn't linear. Some days I felt strong and independent, proud of how far I'd come. Other days, like when a man raised his voice too sharply or moved too quickly in my peripheral vision, I felt like that terrified girl cowering in the corner of a Chicago apartment all over again. Tonight had started as one of the good days. I'd managed to save enough for a security deposit on a better apartment, one with actual working locks and windows that faced the street instead of a dark alley. My manager, Rosa, had even mentioned the possibility of a promotion to assistant manager. For the first time in years, the future felt like something I was moving toward instead of running from. I was refilling water glasses at table 7 when the hostess, Maria, walked past with a man I immediately knew I didn't want to see. My hands stilled on the water pitcher as recognition slammed into me like a physical blow. Tall, lean build, that sandy brown hair he kept perfectly styled, and those pale blue eyes that could look so charming one moment and so cold the next. Marcus Volkov. The water pitcher slipped from my suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the marble floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Conversations paused, heads turned, and I felt heat flood my cheeks as I dropped to my knees to clean up the mess. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pick up the larger pieces of glass. This couldn't be happening. Chicago was a big city. The odds of him walking into this specific restaurant, on this specific night, were astronomical. But there he was, scanning the dining room with those calculating eyes I remembered too well. Looking for me. He'd found me. Rosa appeared at my side with a towel and dustpan, her concerned brown eyes taking in my obvious distress. Calm down, Sophia, I told myself. You're safe here. There are people around. He can't do anything in public. But my body didn't seem to get the message. My pulse hammered in my throat, and that familiar taste of copper filled my mouth. Fear had a flavor, I'd learned. Metallic and sharp. You're stronger now, I reminded myself. You left him. You built a new life. You're not that scared girl anymore. But when Marcus's gaze finally found mine across the crowded dining room, every bit of progress I'd made seemed to evaporate. The smile that spread across his face was the same one he'd worn the night I'd ended up with bruises on my ribs and a split lip. Charming to everyone else, terrifying to me. He was walking toward me now, weaving between tables with that confident stride I remembered. My throat closed up entirely. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but watch him approach like a deer frozen in headlights. The familiar panic response was taking over, the one Dr. Martinez and I had worked so hard to manage. Fight, flight, or freeze. I was definitely freezing. When you've been hurt by someone you trusted, your body remembers that betrayal in ways your mind tries to forget. Every muscle in my body was tensing, preparing for impact. My vision was starting to tunnel, focusing only on Marcus and the predatory way he moved through the restaurant like he owned it. Like he owned me. That's when I noticed the man in the corner booth. He'd been coming to Nana's for months, always alone, always requesting the same table tucked into the back corner where he could see the entire restaurant. Dante something. Italian, obviously wealthy based on his perfectly tailored suits and the way he never looked at the prices on the menu. Probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that looked like he might run his fingers through it when he was thinking, and the kind of intense green eyes that seemed to catalog everything and everyone. Tonight, those green eyes were fixed on Marcus with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold. Calculating. dangerous in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. There was something about Dante that had always made me slightly nervous, an underlying current of power that suggested he was much more than just another wealthy businessman. But right now, that dangerous quality felt less like a threat and more like a shield. Marcus was 3 tables away now. 2 tables. I could smell his cologne, that expensive stuff he'd always worn, the scent that used to make me happy and now made my stomach turn. He was saying something to me, but I couldn't hear him over the rushing sound in my ears. My vision was starting to gray at the edges. 1 table away. Close enough to touch me now. Close enough to hurt me again. That's when Dante Rossini stood up. He moved with a fluid grace that spoke of controlled power, rising from his seat like a predator who'd just decided his prey was close enough. He wasn't particularly tall, maybe 6 feet, but something about the way he carried himself made him seem to fill the entire space around him. His dark suit was impeccable, expensive, but it was the way he wore it that caught attention. Like armor. "Marcus, honey," he was saying, his voice carrying that same false sweetness I remembered. "I've been looking everywhere for you. We need to talk." But then Dante was there, stepping smoothly between us like he'd materialized from thin air. The movement was so natural, so effortless, that for a moment it almost looked like coincidence. Almost. But the way his green eyes fixed on Marcus, the subtle shift in his posture, the complete stillness that seemed to emanate from him, all spoke of very deliberate intent. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Dante said, his voice carrying just the hint of an accent that made certain words sound more musical. "The lady is working. This is her place of business." His voice was calm, conversational even, but there was something underneath it that made Marcus take an involuntary step backward. Something that suggested crossing this man would be a very bad idea. Marcus's charming mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the entitled anger underneath. "And who exactly are you?" he demanded, puffing up his chest in that way he did when he felt challenged. Dante's smile was pleasant, the kind you might give a stranger asking for directions. But his eyes remained cold. Someone who doesn't like seeing women harassed in his favorite restaurant. The possessive way he said his favorite restaurant, combined with the subtle emphasis on his, sent a clear message. This was his territory, and I was under his protection. Marcus looked between us, clearly trying to assess the situation. I could see him cataloging details. Dante's expensive suit, his confident posture, the way the staff had noticed the interaction and were watching nervously. Marcus had always been good at reading power dynamics, at figuring out who he could intimidate and who he couldn't. Whatever he saw in Dante made him recalculate. "Look, I don't want any trouble," Marcus said, his voice taking on that wheedling tone I knew meant he was backing down. "I just need to talk to my girl here. Clear up a little misunderstanding." The words "my girl" hit me like a physical slap, but before I could react, Dante moved a half-step closer to Marcus. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but the effect was immediate. Marcus went very still. "I think you should wait outside," Dante said, his voice still pleasant, but carrying an unmistakable note of command. "I'll take care of this." There was something in the way he said "I'll take care of this" that suggested he was capable of taking care of many things, and not all of them would be pleasant for Marcus. The threat was subtle but unmistakable, wrapped in politeness but sharp as a blade. Marcus's face flushed red, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was outmatched. "Fine," he said, trying to salvage some dignity. "But this isn't over, Sophia. We have unfinished business." The promise in his voice made my blood run cold, but before I could respond, Dante spoke again. "Yes, it is. 2 words. Quiet, final, absolute." Spoken with the kind of certainty that suggested argument wasn't just inadvisable, it was impossible. Marcus opened his mouth like he might say something else, then seemed to think better of it. With one last venomous look at me, he turned and walked toward the exit. I watched him go, hardly daring to breathe until I saw him push through the front doors and disappear into the Chicago night. Only then did I realize I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. "Are you all right?" Dante asked, his voice gentler now, the dangerous edge replaced by something that sounded almost protective. I nodded automatically, then shook my head, then nodded again. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice coming out hoarse. "I'm sorry about the scene. I'll pay for the picture." "I should have." "You should have nothing," he interrupted, his green eyes searching my face with an intensity that made me feel exposed. "You did nothing wrong." There was something in his voice, a certainty that cut through the fog of panic and shame that Marcus always left in his wake. For the first time since I'd seen that familiar figure walking through the door, I could breathe properly. The restaurant was slowly returning to normal, conversations resuming, staff members discreetly cleaning up the broken glass and reassuring other guests. But I could feel Dante's attention focused entirely on me, like I was the only person in the room worth watching. "Thank you," I managed to say. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "And you don't need to find out what would have happened. That's what matters now." Something in his voice, in the way he looked at me like I was worth protecting, made my chest tight with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something dangerous and terrifying and completely inappropriate given the circumstances. Because looking at Dante Rossini, with his perfectly controlled strength and his green eyes that seemed to see everything, I had this sudden, shocking realization that I felt safer standing next to this obviously dangerous man than I had in months of careful, cautious freedom. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of forced normalcy and hypervigilance. Every time the front door opened, my heart jumped into my throat, expecting to see Marcus walking back through. But he didn't return, and somehow I managed to serve my remaining tables without dropping anything else or having another panic attack in front of the customers. Dante had returned to his corner booth, but I could feel his presence like a constant, steady weight at the edge of my awareness. He wasn't watching me exactly, but somehow I knew that if Marcus had tried to come back, Dante would have known about it before the door fully opened. There was something almost predatory about the way he stayed aware of his surroundings, cataloging every person who entered or left, every potential threat. When Rosa finally told me I could clock out, I realized my hands were still shaking slightly as I untied my apron. The familiar end-of-shift routine felt surreal after everything that had happened. How was I supposed to just go home and pretend tonight had been normal? How was I supposed to sleep knowing Marcus knew where I worked? I was gathering my purse from the back office when Rosa appeared in the doorway, her maternal brown eyes full of concern. "Mija," she said softly, "are you going to be okay getting home? I can have Miguel drive you." Miguel was Rosa's 19-year-old nephew who bussed tables and had a tendency to drive like he was auditioning for Fast and Furious. Under normal circumstances, I would have politely declined. Tonight, the offer was tempting. Before I could answer, though, I heard a familiar voice behind Rosa. "That won't be necessary." Dante stood in the doorway, somehow managing to make the cramped back office feel even smaller with his presence. He'd put on a black wool coat that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, and there was something about the way he wore it that suggested he was used to fine things. "I'll make sure she gets home safely," he continued, addressing Rosa, but keeping those intense green eyes fixed on me. "If that's acceptable to you, Sophia." The way he phrased it, asking for my permission instead of simply assuming, should have been reassuring. And it was, in a way, but it also highlighted the fundamental strangeness of the situation. This man, who I barely knew beyond his coffee preferences and the fact that he always left generous tips, was offering to escort me home. A man who had faced down Marcus with the kind of quiet confidence that suggested he was very familiar with confrontation. Rosa looked between us with the shrewd assessment of someone who'd raised 4 children and run a restaurant for 15 years. Whatever she saw in Dante's face must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. "You be careful, Mija," she said, squeezing my shoulder. "And you call me when you get home safe." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The kindness in her tone made my throat tight. Rosa had been nothing but good to me since I'd started working at Nana's, never asking too many questions about my past or why I sometimes flinched when someone moved too quickly behind me. She'd simply given me a job, a chance to rebuild, and treated me like family. 10 minutes later, I found myself standing on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the cool Chicago evening air making me shiver slightly in my thin cardigan. The street was busy enough with late dinner traffic and people heading to nearby bars, but after Marcus's appearance, every shadow seemed potentially threatening. "My car is just here," Dante said, gesturing toward a sleek black sedan parked at the curb. The vehicle looked expensive and understated, the kind of car that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. As we approached, I noticed the windows were tinted darker than was probably legal, and something about the way it sat suggested it might be heavier than a standard sedan. Armored, maybe. The thought should have been alarming, but instead I found it oddly comforting. If Dante felt the need for an armored car, he clearly understood something about living with danger. And right now, that understanding felt more reassuring than frightening. He opened the passenger door for me, a gesture that would have seemed old-fashioned from anyone else, but felt natural from him. The interior was immaculate leather and gleaming surfaces, with that new car smell mixed with something that might have been expensive cologne. As I settled into the passenger seat, I caught a glimpse of what looked like a very sophisticated communication system built into the dashboard. "Where do you live?" Dante asked as he started the engine. The car purred to life with barely a whisper of sound. I gave him my address, a modest apartment complex in a neighborhood that was trying hard to gentrify, but hadn't quite succeeded yet. As he pulled into traffic, I found myself studying his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. There was something classical about his features, like he could have stepped out of a Renaissance painting. Strong jaw, straight nose, those dark eyelashes that seemed almost unfair on a man. "You didn't have to do this," I said finally, needing to break the charged silence that had settled between us. "I mean, what you did back there, making sure I got home safely. I'm grateful, but you really don't owe me anything." He glanced at me briefly before returning his attention to the road. His hands on the steering wheel were steady, elegant, with long fingers that looked like they'd be equally comfortable with a piano keyboard or a gun. "I have 3 sisters," he said simply. "If one of them called me scared because some bastard was harassing them at work, I'd hope someone would step in." The unexpected personal detail caught me off guard. It was the first thing he'd told me about himself that wasn't related to his dinner preferences. "You have 3 sisters?" I asked. "Isabella, Lucia, and Carmela," he said, and there was something warm in his voice when he said their names. "Isabella's 28. She runs an art gallery downtown. Lucia is 25. She's finishing her residency at Northwestern Memorial. And Carmela is 23 and thinks she's going to revolutionize sustainable fashion." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and it did something strange to my chest. This dangerous man who'd faced down Marcus without breaking a sweat had clearly raised, or at least helped raise, 3 accomplished women. It didn't fit with the impression of controlled menace he'd given off at the restaurant. "What about you?" he asked. "Any family in Chicago?" The question was casual enough, but I found myself hesitating. My family was a complicated subject, one that involved a lot of explaining about why I'd moved to Chicago alone and why I hadn't spoken to my parents in over a year. "They live in Minneapolis," I said finally. "We don't really talk much anymore." I could feel him glancing at me again, but he didn't press. Instead, he said, "That must have made leaving difficult. Starting over somewhere new without family support." There was something in his voice that suggested he understood more than I'd explicitly told him. Maybe it was experience with his sisters, or maybe he was just naturally perceptive, but he seemed to grasp that my move to Chicago hadn't been entirely voluntary. "Sometimes starting over is the only choice you have," I said quietly. We drove in comfortable silence for a while after that, the city lights streaming past the windows. Chicago at night was beautiful in a gritty, urban way, all neon and glass and endless possibility. I'd fallen in love with the city during my first week here, when I'd finally realized that I could walk down the street without constantly looking over my shoulder for a familiar face. When we reached my apartment building, Dante pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine. In the sudden quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat again, that nervous flutter that had been my constant companion for months. "Thank you," I said, reaching for the door handle. "Really, I can't tell you how much." He was already getting out of the car. "I'll walk you up," he said, coming around to open my door. "That's really not necessary," I protested, but he was already scanning the parking lot with those sharp green eyes, cataloging potential threats with the same efficiency he'd shown at the restaurant. "Humor me," he said, and something in his tone suggested this wasn't really a request. We walked toward the building entranced together, and I found myself seeing my home through his eyes. The security lighting was inadequate, casting more shadows than it eliminated. Half the exterior lights were burned out, and the lock on the main door was the kind you could probably open with a credit card if you knew what you were doing. It had never seemed particularly unsafe before, but next to Dante's obvious wealth and security consciousness, It felt almost dangerously exposed. "What floor?" he asked as we entered the lobby. "Third floor," I said, leading him toward the elevator. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed and flickered, casting everything in harsh, unflattering light. I noticed Dante's subtle frown as he took in the broken intercom system and the way the elevator buttons were worn smooth from use. When we reached my door, I fumbled for my keys, acutely aware of his presence behind me. He wasn't crowding me exactly, but I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch hints of that expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. That's when I noticed my door was slightly ajar. The sight hit me like ice water. I always locked my door. It was one of the habits Dr. Martinez had helped me develop, part of the safety routine that helped me feel secure in my own space. But the door was definitely open, just a crack, barely visible unless you were looking for it. "Sophia," Dante's voice was sharp, commanding. "Step back." But I couldn't move. I could only stare at that thin line of darkness where my door should have been flush with the frame. He'd been here. Marcus had been in my home, in the one place I was supposed to be safe. Dante's hand closed gently but firmly around my upper arm, drawing me back from the door. "Stay here," he said, his voice carrying that same note of absolute authority he'd used on Marcus. "Don't move." He pushed the door open with his foot, and I caught a glimpse of chaos beyond. My living room looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Couch cushions thrown aside, books scattered across the floor, my carefully organized life reduced to wreckage. "Call the police," Dante said without looking back at me. "Tell them you've had a break-in." But as he stepped inside my violated sanctuary, moving with the careful grace of someone who knew how to handle dangerous situations, I realized I didn't want the police. I wanted him. This man who'd appeared out of nowhere to protect me, who'd made Marcus back down with nothing more than presence and implication. I wanted Dante Rossini, with all his expensive clothes and obvious danger, to make this right. And that realization terrified me almost as much as finding my door open. I woke up in a bed that wasn't mine, wrapped in sheets that probably cost more than my monthly rent, staring at a ceiling that seemed impossibly high above me. For a disorienting moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then it all came flooding back. Marcus, the break-in, Dante's quiet insistence that I couldn't stay in my violated apartment, not tonight, not until he could arrange proper security. His penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building in River North, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. The guest room where I'd spent the night was larger than my entire apartment, decorated in soothing neutrals with touches of deep blue that somehow managed to feel both luxurious and welcoming. The police had come and gone, taking pictures and notes and asking questions I didn't really know how to answer. How long had Marcus been harassing me? Did I have any idea what he might have been looking for? Was there anyone who could verify my whereabouts during the time of the break-in? Dante had handled most of the interaction with a smooth competence that suggested he was familiar with police procedure, though I noticed the officers treated him with a deference that went beyond normal civilian courtesy. Now, in the gray morning light filtering through those expensive windows, I felt the full weight of what had happened. Marcus hadn't just violated my physical space. He'd shattered the fragile sense of security I'd spent 6 months building. The knowledge that he'd been in my home, touching my things, looking through my life, made my skin crawl. I could smell coffee brewing somewhere in the apartment, rich and dark, and infinitely more appealing than the instant stuff I usually made for myself. Following the scent, I padded barefoot through a hallway lined with what looked like original artwork toward what I hoped was the kitchen. I found Dante standing at an enormous granite island, fully dressed in a charcoal suit despite the early hour. He was reading something on his phone while a complicated-looking espresso machine hissed and gurgled behind him. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the highlights in his dark hair and emphasized the strong line of his jaw. There was something almost domestic about the scene, except for the way his eyes immediately found mine when I entered, alert and assessing. "Good morning," he said, his voice still carrying that hint of accent that made ordinary words sound more musical. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," I admitted, which was true. The guest room had felt safe in a way my own apartment hadn't for months. Maybe because I knew Dante was nearby, or maybe because the building's security was obviously several levels above anything I was used to. He gestured toward a chair at the island. Coffee. I make it strong. I nodded, settling onto one of the leather bar stools and trying not to feel overwhelmed by the casual luxury surrounding me. Everything in Dante's kitchen looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Professional-grade appliances, custom cabinetry, a marble backsplash that probably cost more than my car. But there were personal touches too. A small herb garden growing on the windowsill. Family photos on the refrigerator. A well-used cookbook open to a page for Sunday gravy. He poured coffee into a delicate porcelain cup and set it in front of me along with real cream and raw sugar in a crystal bowl. The coffee was perfect, rich and complex with none of the bitterness I was used to from diner coffee and overworked machines. I called in to work for you this morning, he said casually, settling across from me with his own cup. Told Rosa you needed a personal day to deal with the break-in. I should have felt annoyed that he'd made decisions about my schedule without asking. Instead, I felt a rush of gratitude so intense it made my chest tight. When was the last time someone had anticipated what I needed and simply taken care of it? Thank you, I said. I don't know what I would have told her anyway. How do you explain that your ex-boyfriend is escalating his harassment and you're now staying with a man you barely know because he makes you feel safer than the police do? Dante's green eyes studied my face with that same careful attention I was beginning to recognize as habitual. You don't have to explain anything to anyone, he said. Your safety is more important than explanations. The simple declaration hit me harder than it should have. For 2 years with Marcus, my safety had always been conditional, dependent on his mood, his stress level, his perception of my behavior. The idea that someone might prioritize my well-being without conditions attached was almost foreign. I noticed you have pictures of your sisters, I said, gesturing toward the refrigerator where several photos were held by magnets. In one, 3 beautiful women flanked a younger version of Dante, all of them laughing at something outside the frame. You can tell you're close. Family is everything, he said simply. My father died when I was 26. Someone had to make sure the girls finished school, went to college, had the opportunities they deserved. There was something in his voice, a weight that suggested those responsibilities had required sacrifices. I found myself studying his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of stress and early responsibility. He couldn't be much older than 32 or 33, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he'd been carrying adult burdens for a long time. What kind of business did your father have? I asked, then immediately wondered if I was prying. But Dante didn't seem offended by the question. Import and export, he said after a slight pause. Mediterranean goods, primarily. Olive oil, wine, specialty items for restaurants like Nana's. It's a family business going back 3 generations. The explanation sounded reasonable enough, but there was something in the way he phrased it that made me think there was more to the story. Family business could mean a lot of things, especially when combined with the kind of quiet authority Dante wielded and the deference I'd seen from the police officers. I should go back to work tomorrow, I said, changing the subject. I can't just hide here indefinitely. You're not hiding, he corrected gently. You're being smart. But you're right, we can't let him disrupt your entire life. I'll arrange for security when you're at the restaurant. Security? I repeated. You mean like a bodyguard? Something like that, he said, his tone casual enough that I almost missed the steel underneath. Someone to keep an eye on things. Make sure there are no more unwelcome visitors. The rest of the morning passed in a strange, sort of suspended reality. Dante made phone calls in rapid Italian while I showered and changed into the spare clothes he'd had someone retrieve from my apartment. Everything felt surreal, like I was playing house in someone else's life. But there was also something seductive about it. The way Dante seemed to have solutions for everything. The casual competence with which he handled problems that would have left me paralyzed with anxiety. When we arrived at Nana's that afternoon, I noticed the subtle changes immediately. There was a man in a dark suit sitting at the counter who wasn't eating, just drinking coffee and watching the room. Another man in casual clothes at a table near the window, positioned where he could see both the front door and the back exit. They weren't obvious about it, but once I knew to look, their purpose was clear. Rosa pulled me aside within minutes of arriving, her maternal instincts clearly on high alert. Mija, she said quietly, who is this man? And don't tell me he's just a customer who was being nice. I've seen nice customers. This is something else. Before I could figure out how to answer, Marcus's voice crackled through the restaurant's phone system. Rosa had put him on speaker without thinking, and his words filled the dining room with venomous clarity. "Tell Sophia I know she's there," he said, his voice carrying that edge of controlled rage I remembered too well. "Tell her she can't hide forever. Tell her that her new friends might want to be careful about who they're protecting. Accidents happen in restaurants all the time. Kitchen fires, gas leaks, things that hurt innocent people." The blood drained from my face as the implications hit me. He wasn't just threatening me anymore. He was threatening Rosa, threatening my coworkers, threatening everyone who'd show me kindness. That's when I saw Dante move. He'd been sitting at his usual table, apparently reading emails on his phone, but the moment Marcus's voice filled the restaurant, he was on his feet. There was something different about him now, something that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The careful politeness was still there, but underneath it was something cold and lethal. He walked to the hostess station with that fluid grace I was beginning to recognize, took the phone from Maria's nerveless fingers, and spoke in a voice I'd never heard from him before. Low, quiet, and absolutely terrifying. "Listen very carefully," he said, his accent more pronounced now, each word precise and measured. "You will not contact this restaurant again. You will not approach Sophia again. You will not threaten her, her coworkers, or anyone associated with this establishment. If you do, you will discover that there are consequences far more serious than anything the Chicago Police Department can offer." There was a pause, then Marcus's voice again, but now it carried a note of uncertainty. "Who the hell is this?" "Consider me someone with a vested interest in Sophia's well-being," Dante replied, "and someone with the resources to ensure that interest is protected. Are we understanding each other?" The line went dead. The restaurant had gone completely silent during the exchange, every customer and staff member frozen in place. But as Dante set the phone down and returned to his table as if nothing had happened, normal conversation gradually resumed. The two security men remained in place, alert but unobtrusive. That evening, after my shift ended, I found myself in Dante's kitchen again, watching him cook with the same competent grace he brought to everything else. He'd insisted on making dinner, claiming his housekeeper had left ingredients for osso buco that would go bad if not used. "You didn't have to threaten him for me," I said, chopping vegetables at his direction. "I know you barely know me, and I don't want you getting involved in my problems." He looked up from the braising pot, those green eyes serious. "First of all, you're not a problem to be solved, Sophia. You're a person who deserves to feel safe. And second, I didn't threaten him. I made him a promise." The distinction sent a shiver down my spine, but not entirely from fear. There was something darkly reassuring about having someone in my corner who understood exactly how dangerous the world could be. "Tell me about him," Dante said quietly as we worked. "How long were you together?" 2 years, I said, my hands stilling on the cutting board. "We met when I was 21, just out of college. He was charming, successful, everything I thought I wanted. For the first 6 months, he was perfect. Flowers, expensive dinners, weekend trips. I thought I'd won the lottery." Dante nodded, not pushing, just letting me talk. "But perfect doesn't last, does it? The first time he hit me, I told myself it was stress from work. The second time, I told myself I must have done something to provoke it. By the time I realized what was happening, I was so isolated from my friends and family that I didn't know how to leave." My voice was steady as I spoke, which surprised me. Usually talking about Marcus made me feel small and ashamed. But something about Dante's quiet attention made it feel like sharing information rather than confessing failure. "What changed?" he asked. "What made you finally leave?" "He put me in the hospital," I said simply. 3 broken ribs and a concussion. When I woke up, he was there with flowers and apologies, and I realized that if I didn't leave then, I might not get another chance. Dante had gone very still, his hands motionless on the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir the sauce. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an undertone that made me glad I was on his side. "He'll never hurt you again," he said, and it wasn't a promise or a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. Later, as we sat across from each other at his dining table eating the best meal I'd had in months, I found myself studying his face in the candlelight. There were depths to Dante Rossini that I was only beginning to glimpse, layers of complexity that both intrigued and unnerved me. "What about you?" I asked. "You said your father died when you were 26. That must have been difficult, taking over the family business so young." Something flickered across his features, there and gone so quickly I almost missed it. It was necessary, he said. My sisters needed stability, security. Sometimes we do what we have to do, not what we want to do. Do you regret it? Taking on all that responsibility? He considered the question for a long moment, swirling wine in his glass. I regret that I didn't have more time to just be a brother instead of also being a father figure. But I don't regret keeping my family safe and together. There was something in his voice that made me think he understood more about sacrifice and protection than most people our age. Looking at him across the table, with his expensive shirt and his careful control and his green eyes that seemed to see everything, I realized I was beginning to understand what it meant to feel truly protected for the first time in my adult life. And that realization scared me almost as much as it thrilled me. Saturday morning arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and for the first time in months, I woke up without immediately checking the locks. There was something about being in Dante's space that made the hypervigilance that had become my constant companion finally quiet down. Maybe it was the building's obvious security, or maybe it was the knowledge that the man sleeping somewhere down the hall was more dangerous than anything Marcus could throw at me. Dante had given me the day off from reality, insisting that I needed time to recover from the stress of the past week. No work, no obligations, no rushing around the city hoping Marcus wouldn't appear. Just time to exist in this strange, suspended bubble where someone else handled the logistics of keeping me safe. I found him in what he called his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books and dominated by a massive mahogany desk that looked like it had been carved by Renaissance masters. He was reading something in Italian, his dark hair slightly mussed from running his fingers through it, wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater that made him look younger and more approachable than his usual perfectly tailored suit suggested. "Good morning," he said, looking up with a smile that did something warm and fluttering to my chest. "I was beginning to think you might sleep until noon." It felt decadent, I admitted, settling into one of the leather chairs opposite his desk. "I can't remember the last time I slept past 7 without an alarm." "That's because you've been running on survival mode for months," he said, closing the book and giving me his full attention. "Your body is finally letting you rest because it knows you're safe." The matter-of-fact way he said it, like my safety was simply a given now, made something tight in my chest loosen. I'd been so used to being responsible for my own protection, for constantly assessing threats and planning escape routes, that having someone else shoulder that burden felt almost foreign. "What are you reading?" I asked, nodding toward the book he'd set aside. "Dante Alighieri," he said with a slight smile. "My mother insisted all her children should know the classics, especially our namesake's work. She used to say that understanding where we came from was the only way to know where we were going." The past tense when he mentioned his mother caught my attention. "How long has she been gone?" I asked gently. 5 years now," he said, and there was a weight in his voice that spoke of grief that had softened but never fully healed. "Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but in the end," he trailed off, but I could see the pain that flickered across his features. Losing a parent was hard enough without having to become a surrogate father to 3 younger sisters at the same time. "Would you like to see her garden?" he asked suddenly, changing the subject in a way that suggested he wasn't quite ready to delve deeper into that particular loss. "She designed it herself, and I've tried to keep it the way she would have wanted." He led me through a set of French doors onto a terrace I hadn't noticed before, and I found myself stepping into what could only be described as an urban oasis. The rooftop garden was spectacular, with carefully planned sections that showed the hand of someone who understood both beauty and function. Herbs and vegetables grew alongside roses and jasmine, and there was a small seating area surrounded by flowering vines that provided both privacy and a stunning view of the city beyond. "This is incredible," I breathed, running my fingers along the leaves of what looked like basil. "You maintain all this yourself?" "I have help, but I do most of the hands-on work," he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice. "It makes me feel close to her, I suppose. She always said that growing things was an act of faith in the future." There was something deeply intimate about being in this space with him, surrounded by the legacy of his mother's love and his own careful tending. I could picture him out here in the early morning hours, working with his hands, finding peace among the growing things. "Tell me about your family," he said as we settled onto the cushioned bench overlooking the garden. You mentioned they live in Minneapolis, but not much else. I hesitated, not because I didn't trust him, but because talking about my family meant explaining how completely I'd isolated myself in the relationship with Marcus. It means admitting how thoroughly I'd let myself be cut off from everyone who might have helped me. My parents are good people, I said finally. My father teaches high school history. My mother works for a nonprofit that helps immigrants navigate the legal system. I have a younger sister, Lily, who just turned 21. She's in college at the University of Minnesota, studying environmental science. Dante nodded, not pushing, just letting me find my way through the story. When I first started dating Marcus, he was charming to them. Flowers for my mother, long conversations with my father about politics and history. But gradually, he started finding reasons why I shouldn't visit home. Work obligations, social events, little emergencies that always seemed to coincide with family gatherings. The familiar shame crept up my throat as I continued. By the end, I was making excuses for why I couldn't come to Christmas, why I couldn't be Lily's maid of honor when she got engaged, why I was always too busy to talk when they called. They knew something was wrong, but I was too proud and too scared to admit what was happening. When I finally left Marcus, I was too ashamed to call them and explain. How do you tell your parents that you spent 2 years lying to them? That you let someone isolate you from everyone who loved you? You were surviving, Dante said quietly, his green eyes intense with understanding. Isolation is one of the primary tools of abuse, Sophia. It's not your fault that he used it against you. The simple statement, delivered with such certainty, made my throat tight. Dr. Martinez had said similar things, but hearing it from Dante somehow carried more weight. Have they tried to contact you since you left? He asked. They call sometimes, I admitted. Leave voicemails. Lily sends texts asking if I'm okay, but I never know what to say. How do you explain that you're fine now, but you weren't fine for 2 years and you were too ashamed to ask for help? You start with the truth, he said. You tell them you're safe now, and that you're ready to begin rebuilding those relationships if they're willing. He made it sound so simple, but maybe simple was what I needed. Maybe I'd been overthinking something that could be solved with honesty and time. What about you? I asked, turning the focus back to him. You've told me about your sisters, but what about friends? Someone to share the burden of running a family business and taking care of everyone? Something flickered across his face, a momentary vulnerability that he quickly controlled. My world is complicated, he said carefully. The business requires a certain level of discretion. Most people don't understand the pressures that come with that kind of responsibility. There was something in his tone that suggested he was choosing his words very deliberately, and I found myself wondering exactly what kind of import and export business required the level of security and discretion that seemed to surround Dante's life. It sounds lonely, I said softly. It has been, he admitted, his voice quiet. Until recently. The way he looked at me when he said it made my breath catch. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that spoke of feelings much deeper than simple attraction or protectiveness. Something that made my heart race and my skin warm despite the cool morning air. Sophia, he said, and my name sounded different in his voice. More musical, more meaningful. I need you to know that what's happening between us, it's not just about keeping you safe from Marcus. It's more than that. I know, I whispered, because I did know. What I felt when I looked at him went far beyond gratitude for his protection. It was want and need and the terrifying possibility of something I'd never experienced before. Real love, built on trust and respect instead of manipulation and control. He reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, so I had plenty of time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't move, his hand cupped my cheek with infinite gentleness, his thumb stroking across my skin in a touch that was both tender and reverent. May I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough with barely contained desire. The fact that he asked, that he waited for my answer instead of simply taking what he wanted, made something that had been tightly wounded inside me finally relax. Yes, I breathed. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind. And when his lips finally met mine, it was nothing like the demanding, possessive kisses Marcus had claimed as his right. This was exploration and invitation, question and answer, a conversation conducted in touch and taste, and the soft sounds we made against each other's mouths. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless and trembling, but not from fear. From desire, from the overwhelming realization that I wanted this man with an intensity that scared and thrilled me in equal measure. That's when my phone rang. The sound cut through the intimate bubble surrounding us like a knife, and when I saw Lily's name on the screen, my blood ran cold. My sister never called on Saturday mornings unless something was wrong. Sophia, Lily's voice was tight with fear when I answered. There's a man here asking about you. He says he's your boyfriend, and he's worried about you because you haven't been returning his calls. Every muscle in my body went rigid. He's at your apartment? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. He's outside my building, she said. He showed me pictures of you two together, but something feels off about him. He's too intense, too insistent. And he keeps asking where you live now, where you work. I could hear the fear in my baby sister's voice, and rage flooded through me so hot and pure it took my breath away. It was one thing for Marcus to threaten me, to violate my space and my peace of mind. But bringing Lily into this crossed a line I didn't even know existed. Dante was already moving, his phone in his hand, speaking rapid Italian to someone on the other end. Within moments, he was back at my side, his face grim but determined. What's your sister's address? He asked. I rattled it off, my hands shaking as I tried to keep my voice steady for Lily. Stay inside, I told her. Lock your door and don't let him in no matter what he says. Help is coming. Dante's people were already mobilizing, his network of contacts extending far beyond Chicago. Within minutes, he'd arranged for security to reach Lily's building, for the local police to be notified, for Marcus to be removed from the premises before he could do any real damage. But the violation felt complete anyway. He'd found my family, threatened the one person in the world I'd do anything to protect. And in that moment, watching Dante handle the crisis with the same lethal competence he brought to everything else, I realized something that should have terrified me, but didn't. I didn't just trust Dante Rossini with my safety. I loved him. Completely, irrevocably, dangerously. And for the first time in my life, that love felt like strength instead of weakness. When the immediate crisis was handled and Lily was safe, I found myself in Dante's arms, shaking not from fear, but from the overwhelming emotion of being truly protected by someone who would never use that protection against me. I love you, I whispered against his neck, the words spilling out before I could stop them. His arms tightened around me, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I love you too, Sophia, and I'm going to make sure Marcus Volkov never threatens anyone you care about again. It wasn't a promise. It was a vow. And lying in his bed hours later, our bodies intertwined in the aftermath of making love that was both tender and desperate, I knew that whatever came next, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The week following Marcus's attempt to reach Lily passed in a strange, sort of heightened calm. On the surface, everything seemed normal. I returned to work at Nana's under Dante's careful protection, fell into a routine of morning coffee and evening dinners in his penthouse, even managed to have a tearful but healing phone conversation with my parents that left me feeling lighter than I had in years. But underneath the domestic tranquility, I could sense the predatory focus of Dante's organization as they hunted Marcus with systematic precision. Men in expensive suits appeared and disappeared from the penthouse at all hours. Conversations in rapid Italian took place behind closed doors. Phone calls were made and received with the kind of quiet urgency that spoke of serious business being conducted. Dante never hid his activities from me exactly, but he was careful about how much he exposed me to. I understood that he was protecting me not just from Marcus, but from the full reality of what it meant to be involved with a man like him. Still, I caught glimpses. Enough to understand that the Rossini family's import and export business was considerably more complex than olive oil and specialty wines. It was Tuesday evening when Dante's sister Isabella came to dinner, and I found myself face to face with the first member of his family since this all began. She was stunning in an effortless way that spoke of good genes and better breeding, with the same dark hair and green eyes as her brother, but a warmer, more open demeanor. So you're the woman who's got my brother walking around like he just discovered the sun rises in the east, she said, embracing me with genuine warmth despite having met me 30 seconds earlier. Isabella, Dante warned, but there was affection in his voice. What? She said, settling into her chair with a grin that transformed her sophisticated features into something almost impish. It's true. I haven't seen you this relaxed in years, Dante. It's good. Over dinner, I learned that Isabella was not just an art gallery owner, but someone who moved in the same rarefied circles as her brother, someone who understood the weight of family legacy and the compromises it required. She asked me about my work at Nana's with genuine interest, about my family in Minneapolis, about my plans for the future. But there was also an undercurrent of assessment, the kind of subtle evaluation that spoke of someone who needed to be sure I was worthy of her brother's heart. By the end of the evening, when she hugged me goodbye and whispered that she could see why Dante was smitten, I felt like I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't known I was taking. "You fit into this life well," Dante said later as we cleaned up the dinner dishes together. "Isabella likes you, and she's not easily impressed." "What exactly is this life?" I asked, the question that had been building for days finally spilling out. "I know there's more to your business than importing olive oil, Dante. I'm not naive enough to think that normal businessmen need the level of security you maintain or inspire the kind of deference I see from everyone who deals with you." He was quiet for a long moment, his hands stilling on the wine glass he was drying. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "My family has been in Chicago for 4 generations," he said. "We've built a network of businesses and relationships that extend throughout the city and beyond. Some of those relationships exist in areas that the law doesn't always understand or appreciate." It was the most honest he'd been about the nature of his work, and I appreciated that he wasn't trying to lie to me or dress it up in euphemisms. "Are you afraid of that?" he asked, his green eyes searching my face. "Of what it might mean to be involved with someone who operates outside traditional legal boundaries?" I considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. A month ago, the answer would have been an unequivocal yes. But now, after seeing how he protected not just me, but everyone I cared about, after witnessing the way he wielded power with restraint and precision, I found my answer was more complicated. "I'm afraid of a lot of things," I said finally. "But not of you. Not of your world, as long as I'm in it with you." The relief that crossed his features told me how much my answer mattered to him. He pulled me into his arms, holding me against his chest with a fierceness that spoke of emotions too deep for words. That's when Maria from the restaurant called. "Sophia." Her voice was tight with panic when I answered. "Someone took Rosa." The blood drained from my face as the implications hit me. Rosa, who had been nothing but kind to me since the day I started working at Nana's. Rosa, who had called me Mija and worried about me getting home safely and covered my shifts when I was too shaken to work. "What do you mean someone took her?" I asked, even though I already knew. "A man came to the restaurant right after closing," Maria said, her words tumbling over each other in her rush to get them out. "Rosa was locking up alone because Miguel called in sick. The man, he showed Rosa a picture of you and said he had a message. When she told him you weren't there, he forced her into a car." Dante was already moving, his phone in his hand, but I grabbed his arm before he could make the call that would set his people in motion. "He wants me," I said, my voice steady despite the terror clawing at my chest. "Marcus took Rosa to get to me. If I don't show up, he'll hurt her." Dante's face had gone cold, that dangerous stillness I'd glimpsed at the restaurant settling over him like armor. "Over my dead body," he said quietly. But I couldn't let Rosa suffer for my mistakes, for my inability to completely disappear from Marcus's reach. "She's an innocent," I said. "She has 4 children and 6 grandchildren and has never hurt anyone in her life. I won't let her pay for Marcus's obsession with me." "We'll get her back," Dante said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "But not by walking into his trap. We do this smart, with overwhelming force and minimal risk to either of you." Within an hour, Dante's network had located Marcus's position. He was holding Rosa in an abandoned warehouse in an industrial district south of the city, the kind of place where screams wouldn't carry and bodies could disappear without trace. The building was isolated, with multiple exits and clear sight lines in all directions. It was a good choice for someone who wanted to control the situation. But Marcus had made one critical error. He'd underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. "I want to go with you," I told Dante as he prepared to leave for the warehouse. "This is my fault. I should be there." "Absolutely not," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You stay here where you're safe." "No," I said, surprising myself with the steel in my own voice. "Rosa is there because of me. I'm not hiding here while other people clean up my mess. I'm done being a victim, Dante. I'm your partner, or I'm not." Which is it? He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing options, calculating risks, trying to find a way to keep me safe while honoring what I was asking for. You stay in the car, he said finally. You wear body armor. You follow orders without question. And if I tell you to leave, you leave. Understood? The warehouse was dark when we arrived, surrounded by Dante's people in positions that had been carefully planned and precisely executed. I watched from the passenger seat of the armored sedan as Dante spoke quietly into his radio, coordinating movement with the kind of tactical precision that spoke of serious training and experience. When they moved, it was like watching a ballet of violence. Swift, silent, overwhelmingly efficient. The handful of men Marcus had with him were neutralized within minutes, professional soldiers reduced to unconscious obstacles by people who operated on an entirely different level. I saw Dante enter the building through a side door, moving with lethal grace, and then everything went quiet. 10 minutes later, Rosa emerged on her own power, shaken but unharmed, escorted by two of Dante's men who treated her with the same careful respect they would show their own grandmother. Marcus didn't come out at all. When Dante returned to the car 20 minutes later, there was something different about him. The controlled danger that always simmered underneath his polished exterior had been fully unleashed and then carefully contained again. His hands were clean, his suit unmarked, but his eyes held a flatness that spoke of recently completed violence. Is he dead? I asked quietly. He'll never threaten you or anyone you care about again, Dante replied, his voice carrying the finality of an epitaph. I should have felt horror. Should have been appalled by the confirmation that the man I loved had just killed someone, even someone like Marcus. Instead, all I felt was a deep, settling relief. It was over. Finally, truly over. Thank you, I whispered, taking his hand in both of mine. You don't need to thank me for protecting what's mine, he said, his green eyes finding mine in the dim light of the car interior. The drive back to his penthouse passed in comfortable silence. Rosa safe in another car with an escort to take her home to her family. As we rode the elevator up to Dante's floor, I found myself thinking about the choice I'd made tonight. Not just to go with him to the warehouse, but to fully embrace what it meant to love a man like Dante Rossini. I'd seen the violence he was capable of, witnessed the cold efficiency with which he'd eliminated a threat to both of us. And instead of being afraid, I felt protected, cherished, claimed in the best possible way. In his bedroom later, as he held me against his chest and stroked my hair with hands that had ended a life just hours before, I finally understood what it meant to be truly safe. Not just physically, but emotionally. Completely. I love your world, I whispered against his neck. I love you in it. I love us in it together. His arms tightened around me, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. Then welcome home, cara mia, he murmured. Welcome home. The morning after Marcus's elimination dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline sunlight that made Chicago look like a city reborn. I woke in Dante's arms feeling something I hadn't experienced in over 2 years, complete safety. Not the tentative, conditional safety of hiding, but the absolute security that came from knowing the threat had been permanently neutralized. Dante was already awake when I opened my eyes, his green gaze studying my face with the careful attention I'd grown to love. How are you feeling? He asked, his voice soft in the morning quiet. Free, I said, and realized it was completely true. For the first time since I'd met Marcus Volkov, I could think about the future without fear clouding every possibility. Over breakfast, Dante laid out the immediate practicalities with his usual methodical precision. Rosa would receive a generous settlement for her trauma, along with assurances that nothing like this would ever happen again. The warehouse incident would be handled quietly, with no blowback on any of us. My apartment building's security would be upgraded, though Dante hoped I wouldn't be needing it anymore. I want you to meet my family, he said as he refilled my coffee cup. All of them. If you're going to be part of this life, you should understand what that really means. The formal introduction to the Rossini family took place the following Sunday at Isabella's gallery during a private exhibition opening. It was elegant and understated, the kind of event that drew Chicago's most influential citizens without any obvious fanfare. But watching the way people moved around the room, the subtle deference shown to Dante and his sisters, The careful positioning of men I now recognized as security, I began to truly understand the scope of the family's influence. Lucia, the doctor's sister, was warmth and sharp intelligence wrapped in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary. She asked about my recovery from recent trauma with the careful concern of someone who understood both medicine and the lasting effects of violence. Carmela, the youngest at 23, was a whirlwind of enthusiasm and perfectly articulated opinions about sustainable fashion, social justice, and her brother's obvious besottedness. She proclaimed me exactly what Dante needed within 10 minutes of meeting me, which earned her a fond, exasperated look from Isabella. But it was meeting Dante's uncle Salvatore that truly brought home what I was becoming part of. He was in his 70s, impeccably dressed, with the kind of old-world courtesy that spoke of generations of breeding and power. When Dante introduced me as someone important to him, the old man studied me with sharp eyes that missed nothing. La famiglia è tutto, he said to me in Italian, then repeated it in English for my benefit. Family is everything. When you love one of us, you become one of us. Are you prepared for what that means, Cara? Yes, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I am. He smiled then, a transformation that made his weathered features warm and approachable. Bene, he said. Then welcome to the family. The weeks that followed were a careful integration of my old life with my new reality. I returned to work at Nana's, but now with the knowledge that the restaurant was under the Rossini family's protection. Rosa, fully recovered from her ordeal, treated me with the same maternal affection she always had, but there was a new respect there too. She'd seen what happened to people who threatened her staff, and she understood what it meant that I was under Dante's personal protection. It was on a quiet Thursday evening, exactly 2 months after the warehouse, that Dante asked me to take a walk with him through his mother's garden. The autumn air was crisp, and the late-season flowers were showing their final burst of color before winter claimed them. I have something I need to ask you, he said, and there was something in his voice that made my heart skip. He led me to the bench where we'd shared our first kiss, where I'd told him about my family, and he'd revealed the depth of his protective instincts. The city stretched out below us, all lights and possibilities, and I thought about how much my life had changed since that night he'd stepped between me and Marcus at the restaurant. Sophia, he said, taking my hands in both of his. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You've brought light to places I didn't even realize were dark. You've made me remember what it feels like to hope for something beyond just duty and obligation. He dropped to one knee then, producing a ring box from his jacket pocket with hands that were almost steady. The ring inside was stunning, a classic solitaire that managed to be both elegant and timeless, exactly what I would have chosen for myself if I'd been brave enough to dream that big. I know my world is complicated, he continued, his green eyes intense with emotion. I know there are risks that come with loving me, challenges that other women will never have to face. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you, cherishing you, building something beautiful with you. Will you marry me, Carmia? Will you be my wife, my partner, my everything? Yes, I whispered, then louder, as joy bubbled up through my chest. Yes, of course yes. The ring fit perfectly, which made me suspect Isabella had been involved in the planning. As Dante slipped it onto my finger, I realized that this moment, this proposal in a rooftop garden overlooking the city where we'd found each other, was exactly what I dreamed of when I still allowed myself to dream. We planned the wedding for spring, a small intimate ceremony that honored both our backgrounds while acknowledging the unique nature of Dante's position in Chicago. My parents flew in from Minneapolis, and the reunion I'd been dreading for so long turned out to be exactly what I needed. They understood that I'd been through something terrible and had emerged stronger. They could see the happiness radiating from me, the way Dante looked at me like I hung the moon, and that was enough for them. The ceremony took place in the same church where Dante's parents had been married, with Father Lorenzo, who had known the family for 3 generations, performing the service. It was traditional and beautiful, with white roses and soft music and all the classic elements I dreamed of as a little girl. But it was also uniquely ours, with vows we'd written ourselves that spoke of protection and partnership, of choosing love even when it came with complications. Dante's uncle Salvatore walked me down the aisle, since my father was busy crying too hard to be trusted with the task. As I approached the altar where Dante waited in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his eyes bright with unshed tears, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From that terrified waitress freezing in panic to this woman walking confidently toward her future, everything had changed. The reception was held at Isabella's gallery, transformed for the evening into an elegant celebration space. Chicago's most influential families mingled with my parents and sister, with Rosa and the staff from Nanas, with Dr. Martinez who had helped me rebuild my self-worth. It should have been an odd mixture, but somehow it worked. Love has a way of bringing disparate worlds together. 6 months after the wedding, Dante made good on a promise I hadn't realized he'd made. He purchased Nanas from the previous owners and offered me full partnership in running the restaurant. It wasn't charity or an attempt to keep me occupied. It was recognition that I had genuine skill and passion for the hospitality industry, and a way for me to maintain my independence within our marriage. The restaurant thrived under our joint management. Dante's business connections brought new customers, while my understanding of day-to-day operations ensured that quality never suffered for success. Rosa was promoted to head chef. Miguel got his college tuition paid in exchange for continuing to work weekends, and we hired 3 new servers to handle the increased business. I found unexpected fulfillment in the administrative side of restaurant management, discovering I had a talent for scheduling and vendor relations that complemented Dante's natural business acumen. We made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. But it was the personal moments that made everything worthwhile. Coming home to the penthouse each evening to find Dante already there, cooking dinner or reading in his study. Waking up each morning next to the man who'd saved me in every way that mattered. Learning that love could be both passionate and peaceful, exciting and comfortable, all at the same time. We traveled together, taking long weekends to visit his business interests in other cities. I learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of his world, understanding when to speak and when to listen, how to be supportive without being subservient. Dante's associates came to respect me not just as his wife, but as a partner who understood the delicate balance of their enterprises. The best part was watching him relax into happiness. The tension that had always lived in his shoulders gradually eased. He laughed more, worried less, allowed himself to believe in a future that included joy alongside responsibility. His sisters teased him about becoming soft, but I could see the relief in their eyes that their brother had found someone to share his burdens. 1 year later, I stood in the same rooftop garden where Dante had proposed, my hand resting on the small bump that was just beginning to show beneath my dress. The pregnancy had been a surprise, but a welcome one. Dr. Martinez assured us that my body had healed completely from the trauma of my relationship with Marcus, and there was no reason to expect anything but a healthy, happy baby. Dante emerged from the penthouse carrying 2 cups of coffee, moving with the same fluid grace that had first caught my attention but now softened by contentment. When he saw me standing among his mother's flowers, one hand protectively curved over our growing child, his entire face lit up with wonder. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, offering me a cup of decaffeinated coffee that had become our morning ritual since we'd learned about the baby. "Good morning yourself," I replied, accepting the kiss he pressed to my temple. How did the call with Sicily go? The family's Italian operations had been expanding, requiring more of Dante's attention and occasional travel. But he'd made it clear that once the baby arrived, his priorities would shift dramatically. The business would always be important, but his family would come first. "Very well," he said, settling beside me on the bench. "Uncle Salvatore is pleased with the new arrangements. We should be able to wrap up the expansion within the next few months, well before our bambino arrives." The way he said our bambino, with such pride and tenderness, made my chest tight with emotion. This man who commanded respect throughout Chicago's most dangerous circles became putty in my hands whenever he thought about our unborn child. Below us, the city was waking up to another beautiful autumn day. From our perch high above the streets, we could see people heading to work, children walking to school, the endless flow of life that made Chicago such a vibrant place to call home. "Do you ever regret it?" Dante asked suddenly. "Giving up the simple life for all this complexity?" I considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. A year ago, I'd been a woman running from her past, working at a restaurant and living in a tiny apartment, afraid to trust anyone or plan for the future. Now I was married to one of the most powerful men in Chicago, pregnant with his child, co-owner of a successful restaurant, and integrated into a family network that operated on both sides of the legal spectrum. Never, I said firmly. This life, with all its complications, is exactly where I belong. The truth was that I discovered something about myself through loving Dante. I wasn't the kind of person who needed simple and safe. I needed partnership and passion, challenge and growth. I needed someone who would fight for me and with me, who would protect me without diminishing me. What about you? I asked, turning the question back on him. Do you ever wish you'd fallen for a nice Italian girl from a good family who would have been content to just be a mafia wife? He laughed, the sound rich and genuine. Never, he said, echoing my own words. You challenge me, Sophia. You make me better than I thought I could be. You've turned my house into a home and my obligations into something that feels like choice. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the city come alive below us. The restaurant would open for lunch in a few hours, and we'd both be there to oversee the service. This afternoon, Carmela was coming to dinner to tell us about her latest sustainable fashion venture. This weekend, we were having lunch with my parents who were visiting to check on their daughter and future grandchild. It was an ordinary life in many ways, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought us together. Morning coffee, work we enjoyed, family dinners, planning for a baby. The same basic elements that made anyone's life meaningful, just wrapped in designer clothes and protected by men with expensive suits and dangerous smiles. As we prepared to head downstairs and start our day, Dante caught my hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my wedding ring. Ti amo, cara mia, he murmured. Forever and always. I love you too, I replied, standing on my toes to kiss him properly. Forever and always. We walked back into the penthouse together, ready to face whatever the day might bring. And as I felt the baby flutter gently in my womb and saw the man I loved preparing to take on the world for our family, I realized that sometimes the best love stories begin with the worst moments. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're really worth fighting for. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman frozen in terror as her abusive ex walked into her workplace. Today, I was Sophia Rossini, wife and mother to, business owner and beloved daughter-in-law. A woman who'd learned that true strength came not from surviving alone, but from choosing the right person to build a life with. Speaking of building lives together, I'd love to hear about your own experiences with finding strength in unexpected places. Have you ever discovered that what seemed like your worst moment actually led to your greatest happiness? Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes we all need reminding that our struggles can become the foundation for something beautiful.